In the past, I've put out a lot of different videos on specific parts of the literature review process. You can go take a look, screening, research writing, a little bit about evidence synthesis. I've also gone through kind of the maybe 5 or so steps involved, but what I'd like to do is go through a pretty unscripted research literature review process that I, again, have not prepared for. It's on a topic that I think is really interesting that has some broad appeal. And it's also the type of topic that we as a research firm would typically look at and report on for clients. And so I'll reiterate, right now we have 2 companies that we're operating. Moara, Mother of All Research Assistants, is one of them. The other is called Sourced Economics. And in that role, we get up just about every single day and do nothing but read through papers and prepare literature reviews for clients. That is really what I'd love to do here. So if you're looking for sort of buttoned up bullet points, I think this is probably not the right video. But if you really just want to hear my entire thought process, how I'm going through the really messy process of a literature review, how I'm analyzing certain sources, I think it could be helpful. It is not something I plan to edit too much, so let's just kind of get into it. What I really want to study and look at and prepare something on is the effects of remote work on productivity. I'm going to call it an end-to-end literature review process. The reality is, though, there isn't one. There's no end-to-end literature review process, really. If you're working on a serious deliverable, like a major report, a publication, or a dissertation, every step I cover here should really be recurring. So yes, there is a big search process up front, for example, but you should really be finding and incorporating new papers throughout your paper, throughout preparing your dissertation and going through your research. So again, for maybe a PhD student, someone working on a big publication, take these steps and really blow them up. Make them regular things you're going to do. I talk often about the importance of planning and how you need a good tech stack up front. And so the tech stack that I'm using here is pretty straightforward. I'm just planning is in Claude. I've put out a couple different videos about the fact that Claude is really great for kicking off and scoping your review, figuring out your research question, for example, getting some summaries. For search engines, I list 3 here. The reality is, for a big project, you should be using a lot of different search engines. Your goal should seriously be to not miss any paper. There shouldn't be a paper if someone, for instance, catches you by surprise with, hey, did you see this? Especially a highly cited one. That's it's a bad look if you don't have a good handle on the literature on a topic. B, you might have missed some important points from that paper. For reference management, I will use our product, Moara, Mother of All Research Assistants. I'm really going to call it reference management and analytics, let's say. And then writing for me involves multiple tools. Now, our team uses Overleaf, so it's a LaTeX application for writing. In this case, I'm just going to use Microsoft Word. And then I will do some iterating with Claude and with our own product also. I would say writing is where everyone has a different process, more or less iterative. I know, for example, for me, when it comes to writing, I do not, I don't like to prepare outlines early on because I like to get a little inspiration as I go through a project. It's also the nature of our deliverable. We do client work and prepare client deliverables. So we're not typically writing a methodology, intro methodology, data sources, discussion analysis. Usually it's just highlighting the most important empirical findings that we can present for our clients. So this is my tech stack. Everyone can develop their own. And last slide here, our goal. Everyone might have a slightly different goal, but it probably comes down to something like contribute something new and useful to your audience and even to the world. Okay, so in the case of our clients, we want to present something to them that's maybe, first of all, well supported, but useful in the sense that it's counterintuitive. It challenges some hypotheses they have. It has some implications in terms of organizational structure or strategic planning or product selection. So new and useful are the 2 dimensions that are important to me. So let's move on to, and again, I'm just going to jump right into this. It's not very formal, but the steps here, first thing I'm going to do is set up my library. And the reason I want to do that is I want to have something I can staple papers onto, just in case. I know I said I would do planning and scoping. If I come across some important papers, which I should, I want to put them into my library. So let me just go ahead and create that. I'm going to say writing a paper for a client on the effects of remote work on productivity. and I'm going to set that up. This will not set me up with search results. That's not what Moara is all about. Just going to set me up with a workspace, right? And so here I can, I'm going to come back to this in a second to execute some of my search. But actually, first, I'm just going to open that up so I can start dropping papers in. But I'm gonna actually, Claude is going to be the first substantive piece of a sort of data source for my review. I very often, and my approach changes frequently. I would say, if you looked back a year or two ago, I would almost always start with a review paper. So what a review paper is something that, again, performs a literature review on a topic and then publishes that literature review. That's pretty straightforward, but it's always a good thing to look for a review paper. It might not be exactly your topic, it might not be exactly up to date, but it might give you a table with papers and results and whatnot. That's generally how I used to like to start, so I just jump into papers. I would say my philosophy now is a little bit more that it's good to start with getting a comprehensive high level overview of the literature on a topic. So in this case, I'm going to say, give me an overview of the academic literature on the effects of remote work on productivity, consensus, key debates, how's the research evolved. I really feel like there's very little harm and a lot of benefit you get from reading through these types of summaries. Maybe you fire through a few different literature review tools, look at those summaries. You see I have undermined up here. I'm going to use it primarily for search, but it's also good for summaries. And then, with a topic like this, if I had time, I would actually be jumping into the secondary research as well. That is online articles, Harvard Business Review articles, even New York Times piece on the topic that might have some. I think it's very, very helpful to, especially for industry client work, but even for academic work, it's helpful to know how folks that aren't totally entrenched in the literature are talking about the subject. I think that's interesting. Helps you to identify counterintuitive findings, things that are underappreciated in the public landscape on a topic as you're going through paper. So this is the first step, right? Go through summaries, understand the consensus, understand how people are talking about the topic. However, you cannot, in my view, call yourself a real expert on the subject until you dive into the literature directly. So this is going to be the first part. Last thing I'll say as to why this is important is if you have a narrative in your head, right? You have a story as to how maybe the literature's evolved on a topic. I do feel all of the papers you read will resonate better, right? They'll stick to that story. You'll understand in what context they're produced. So you can't trust every single data point you get here, especially if there's statistical ones, but you want to take it all with a grain of salt, but it gives you a nice story. So in this case, again, I'm just going to do this right on the fly. And in fact, I'm sorry. First thing I'm going to do is set up the undermine search because undermine takes a while to run. So I want to get the search results here. I'm going to do effects of remote work on productivity, and I'll skip that, and all I'm going to say here is studying the effects of remote work on productivity. My hypothesis or my understanding of this space, because I've actually given students an assignment about this. There was like a big article I had them review. I think it's mixed effects. Some are positive, some are negative. That's my hypothesis, but we'll see if that's true. Okay, so undermine always gives you two follow-up questions. What are you ultimately trying to understand with the search? For example, whether remote work increases or decreases productivity overall, when it helps versus hurts. I would say kind of all of the above. Why all of the above? If I look at those two bullet points, yes, increase or decrease is important. You want that data point, but for our clients, they're going to need to know, for example, what types of professions you have the biggest productivity gains or losses in. You need to know what industries you have the biggest productivity gains or losses in. That is often the problem when it comes to industry work, is making that translation from academic papers that are sometimes really lofty and abstract to practical, private sector policy, business policy decisions, and new initiatives. And so I'm going to put all of the above for the first one. And then for the second one, I'll put how broad do you want the search to stay? Keep it wide across economics, management, or stay in one lens? I would say broad. And again, I want to set this up because Undermine takes about 5 minutes to run. And then the benefit of Undermine is you get great search results. It's a good search engine. Typically not one for, building a library of, say, 50 papers, but you should really cross-reference every search result you get with the ones you find in undermine. Should the search distinguish between pre-pandemic? I would say no, because no, do not distinguish. The reason I'd say no is because I'd be really interested. How do I say this? If you have the same types of empirical results pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, that just points to that helps you gain confidence in those results. And so, if there is some kind of significant change, for example, between, let's say you have a positive effect of remote work on productivity pre-pandemic, post-pandemic you don't, you're going to have to take those results with more of a grain of salt, because it leads you to think, is there some omitted variable bias? We know that it's a little hard to measure with such a major event the precise effects associated with one thing, which is work from home. The reality is school was canceled. The reality is, there were a lot of health issues in people's families. So if there are differences between those two sets of results in general, that's going to make us think, well, I don't know if, you're going to lose some confidence in those results. And that's all very important data. It's very important to have a good sense of limitations, both for client work and for your own work. So I'm going to say no there. I don't want to belabor that point. Do you want the search centered strictly on productivity or also include nearby outcomes? I think nearby outcomes is very interesting. And we have to sort of read the room in terms of our client work. But if we get this question from our clients, yes, if there's a significant decrease in productivity or increase in productivity, but there's a lack of growth or innovation, that is something we need to tell the complete story in that case. If you're an academic researcher and you are really just honing in on maybe an econometric model that studies that question, maybe you don't need this. But for that reason, I'm going to say, include nearby outcomes as well. And these are pretty good questions. Let's make sure we got the launch. Okay, I sometimes read through this. Let me just skim it. So this is the final output based on our responses. Search should stay broad and include work across relevant fields. It should cover whether remote work increases or decreases productivity overall, when it helps or hurts, and how effects differ across context, job types. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Let's launch the search. And now this search should take, around 5 minutes. Let's use that time to go back to getting into our literature overview and our seminal papers. Seminal papers, as most probably know, is very, very highly cited papers that really drove a transformation or shift in the space. Things that, once again, are very highly cited on a topic. And I think that is part of the overarching story we need to sort of get a handle on. So take a sip of coffee here. Okay, let's just get into this overview and read through it. It should be an interesting topic for everyone. Academic study of remote work stretches back several decades. Undoubtedly, field was transformed by COVID-19. Turned a niche practice into a dominant mode of knowledge. Resulting research has produced more nuanced picture than the headlines often suggest. One where the answer to does that boost productivity depends heavily on what kind of work, which kind of workers, and what you're measuring. Undoubtedly. I'm not surprised that's the case. Broad consensus that hybrid arrangements appear to be close to a free lunch. That's really interesting. Workers are as productive as their fully in-office peers, quit less often, report higher satisfaction. This is the strongest consensus finding in the post-2020 literature. Fully remote work is more contested. The effects are sensitive to job type. Yep, this isn't surprising. This is interesting. I had mentioned the distinctions. Early pandemic studies found modest productivity losses, particularly in jobs requiring collaboration, mentoring, or a tacit knowledge transfer. Now, keep in mind one thing, and then we'll move on. Understanding how these models typically work, my best guess would be that these summaries are prepared from a handful of well-cited papers. That is typically, those are the sources driving a summary like this. So indeed, you don't have Claude going out and doing a meta-analysis of 100 papers, of course. And typically, it's not just based on maybe online articles or Reddit discussions or something. You probably have, my guess is in this section right here, this is just a guess, but even though they're not cited, my guess is what's really informing this is about 5 studies. That would just be my guess. And therefore, of course, you need to make sure you're getting into the nuances of this after you go through your summary. But this gives you the big picture so that it's much easier to compare papers, understand where they fit in the timeline, et cetera, once you get into articles. Time savings from eliminated commutes are real and large. It's a very good point. We all know that anecdotally. 8% wage equivalent. That's interesting. Time saving, the non productivity effects are robustly positive. Higher job satisfaction, lower turnover, higher perceived autonomy, and expanded labor force participation. Also, again, a really good point. Now, I think those are some of those are very important for an individual client. Some of them aren't. From a macroeconomic perspective, if you're an academic, I think that's super important. One thing I don't see here that I find to be an interesting question is the effects on growth and innovation. I think that would be a really important one. Key debates, and I guess some of that is wrapped up in productivity as well, right? The key debates: selection versus treatment effects. Does remote work make workers more productive? Does it attract different workers? Interesting. Measurable output versus hard to measure outputs. Call center calls and lines of code are easy to count. Mentoring, innovation, culture, be it building development or not. That's a really interesting one. What I'm looking for in that case is some very kind of articles on the fringe. Here's a great example of something you can't typically get from a AI summary, right? Or from a LinkedIn article or something. Is, can we find some papers that are a little bit cutting edge? Maybe they don't have perfect methodologies, perfect data strategies, but if you read through them and you think that they seem incredibly convincing, I think that's a really interesting one to that you need full text articles for. Full remote versus hybrid. Yep, we've talked about that. Worker heterogeneity, productivity effects vary by gender. That's interesting. Tenure, job type, and home environment quality. Short run versus long run. Recurring concern is that remote work's costs compound over time through weaker networks, less monitoring, reduced innovation. All really interesting. Um, Let's run through this quickly. How the research has evolved. Pre-2020, psychology and management literature. Not surprising, right, that this would start in psychology because, and management for that matter. Once you get into the economics literature, there's a lot of econometrics. You need a lot of data. And I think probably, other than maybe some experimental studies and maybe some observational data here and there, but probably less of a statistics intensive area of research. My guess is it was much more experimental, survey based, et cetera. Those are what you typically get in psychology and management studies. So, first, credible causal evidence. That's interesting. Random assignment. Pandemic natural experiment. We know that. Broadly positive for hybrid capable knowledge workers, negative for some specific contexts like IT services. That's really interesting. Forced full remote with kids at home. There's a very good example. One thing we're going to want to look at in all of our studies is, especially if you're doing a big review, you should be able to answer this question of what are the control variables used in those models to make sure you're accounting for all the different changes that went on during the kind of worst of the pandemic. 23 to 25, decomposition, heterogeneity, and hybrid consensus. I'm going to read through this one because this is kind of a current state. Research has matured towards separating selection from treatment, measuring outcomes beyond simple output, and converging on the view that hybrid is close to optimal for most knowledge work. The bloomhangtrip.com hybrid RCT published has become the new reference point. Okay. Hopefully we have that one. Okay, here it is right here. So we do have that one already in our list. Okay, there it is. So I think those are all really interesting. Not a tremendous amount of unexpected points there. And that's, again, a good example of why it is you really need to dive in the literature to become a total expert on the field. But now we have some of the key debates, for example. Seminal papers. Actually, what I'm going to do here is rather than jumping into these, or excuse me, rather than reading through the summaries, I feel like I got a good amount of that from the overarching summary, which inevitably incorporated probably at least some of those seminal papers. First thing I'm actually going to do is try to get the full texts. Now, most of you probably have an institutional sign-in or something. Here's what I'm going to do. In this case, I'm going to just add these. So let me go back to Moara for a second. I just went ahead and saved down a PDF. So this is the first thing I'll do, which is add that PDF I just saved. Okay, that's pretty simple. Now, for the other ones, I'm actually just going to find them on Google Scholar. That's the easiest way to do this. I'll show why in a second, but for me, it's because I have the LibKey, our organization, GW is where I teach. I've got GW's LibKey here. So I'm just going to use the LibKey integration later on the site to grab this article. So let's do that. i.e., it's always, there are different ways to get PDFs. We do prefer full text, particularly for seminal papers, of course. And so if it's right here, I'll do it. We've got a working paper. Keep in mind, again, this is a working paper. So Claude usually returns pretty good seminal papers, but should a working paper from a preprint repository really be a seminal paper? Probably not. Let me just go ahead and I'll reiterate, everyone's got a different process for this. Let's open these up and see what we can get. We already opened this. We had already grabbed that one. Blah, blah, blah. So full text should be right here. Full text is right here. Okay, so we've got all the full text except for one. I'll download that. And then let's just go ahead and import those, make it really simple. And that way we have all the data we need to do things like make annotations later. I won't do much of that on this session, but I'm going to add those three. So now we have our 5 seminal papers. It's indicated on the Moara site. These are full text. This is a title and abstract. Again, if you've used Moara, you might know how some of this works. I'm going to jump into our screening tool. And here's why I'm going to jump into our screening tool is that this is where I can take advantage of my libkey integration. So this is GW Himmelfarb library. Always a little bit of a process to grab full text articles. That's why what I recommend, at least what I do, if someone else has a suggestion, let me know. But what I really like to do is when I'm kind of ripping through search results, if the PDF is right there available, great, I grab it and I use that and import it into my library. If it's not, I just put in title and abstract because at some point I'm going to need to go through some title and abstract screening. Okay, so all of these are coming from my downloaded files. And that should upload now. Okay, great. So now we have our 5 seminal papers. We've put that together. I just wanted to make sure we covered those. Before we even go through undermine, what I'd actually, exit out of that. Before we even go through undermine, what I'd actually really like to do is we can exit out of this. If you want, one thing you can always do is to copy and paste this into, or you could save it, or what you could do is copy and paste it into your Moara library in the agent. Sometimes that's helpful to do so that you can, for example, ask questions about which paper aligns with which of those findings, but you don't have to do that. I think for now, we've got that information stored, and I'll reiterate, if we had more time, what I would really recommend doing is you spend a whole day or even a couple days getting a handle on how people are talking about this issue. Read every article in the last couple years that's been published in a major newspaper, every article that's been, gotten a ton of views on even LinkedIn. I really mean it when I say Medium posts, Reddit posts. I mean, when we tear into a new subject, the first thing I do is try to get my hands around every source that I can find. So we did the first part, right? We've gone through that kind of summary. Right now we could see what Moara did was pull all of the DOIs, and that way we have citation counts, all the information we need. We've got journals, etc. All sorts of things I can do here. But first, let me go ahead and go through a bit of a high volume process now to put together papers. I'll reiterate, especially if you're working on a big review, but even in our case, we want to make sure we're not leaving anything on the table, especially now because it is not the case that you have to go through every article. So it's not as if you can say, hey, we only have 3 weeks to do this. Therefore, or even a week, I can only look at 20 papers. So I'm just going to pick 20. That's sort of still the case, but there's no reason with tools like Moara and like Undermine and all sorts of tools out there. There's no reason you can't work from a huge corpus of papers, okay? Just use the agent to screen if you need to. Use a wide range to start. And so I'm just going to type this in. Effects of remote work on productivity. And look, Google Scholar gets a lot of crap. The reality is Google Scholar is a great search engine. A, there's tons of results. B, they're very, very good results. We've tested them even against some of the newer AI literature search tools, and Google Scholar actually outperforms some of them. And C, at least in the case of Moara, it allows you to add a lot of papers to your library. Let me just quickly show you, spoiler alert, what Undermine looks like. Now, the frankly, kind of the issue with a lot of these tools is that many of the features that exist are dependent on those papers. So we have a summary, for example. What I'd actually like to do is read the first line of this summary just to continue to get educated at the high level. The literature does not support a single average effect of remote work on productivity. Hybrid or limited flexibility often preserves or modestly hybrid or limited flexibility preserves or modestly improves measured performance while improving retention and satisfaction, but full-time remote work more often lowers output where coordination, supervision, or learning are central. I'm just really curious. Okay. So those two basically align, right? Early studies found modest productivity losses as a result of fully remote, particularly in jobs requiring collaboration, mentoring, or tacit knowledge transfer. So just from these summaries, and now we've got direct references to go with them, we can already get a sense for the main directional findings and how well supported those are. And so, again, we can start to figure out the confidence with which we can present insights to our clients, or in this case, the confidence with which you can present the prior literature in your own review and come up with new ideas. So that's that. I won't read through all of this, but as you can see, we can pull PDFs, but it's a little bit hard to interact with all of this. Let's go back to Moara for a second. When you're doing a real broad review, you can just batch add, just, honestly scrape through 10 pages and just batch add all 10 within each to the library. What I'm going to do is do what I'll call title screening. And so I'm going to look at a couple things. Obviously, namely, it's with Google Scholar, you have snippets. That's good. You can look at that. I'm probably just going ahead. If I'm doing a huge review, yeah, I want some papers that sort of adjacently cover my topic. For something that's client work, that's usually on a deadline, I am going to pick studies that whose primary focus is this topic. So, work from anywhere, productivity effects of geographic flexibility. It's 2021. Lots of citations. I'm going to go ahead and add that. Let me move a little bit faster here. Personality traits, remote work and productivity 2022. Workers' productivity, yet the effect of remote work and productivity between personality traits. Sort of interesting, so I'll add that. That's not really, I'd like sort of a more objective study. Productivity effects of geographic flexibility. Looks like this is interestingly enough, the pre-pandemic version. So let's go ahead and add that as well. That's an interesting strategy, and it's interesting they created this study 1 year before. Super fascinating. Effective remote work on employees' productivity levels in South Africa. In that case, I'm sure there are some very good results there, but I'm going to avoid it because it's only 12 citations. And further, if our primary focus is US, maybe I'll come back to that, but let's just skip it for now. Does remote work improve or impair firm labor productivity? Longitudinal evidence. Overall job performance remote. So some of this is going to be comparing, right? I might go back and decide to add these if I realize actually the top 20 results aren't quite as awesome as I thought they would be, aren't as recent as I thought that maybe we should go back to those. Overall job performance, remote work engagement, living with children, remote work. I want that because this is a really juicy topic, right? We've got to figure out how to account for the other factors involved. Okay, remote work, employee productivity, and innovation. That is the moderating roles of knowledge sharing and digital. I want that one because I talked a lot about innovation. I want to know innovation, job training, etc. Implications of productivity in the Saudi financial sector. Too specific, both in terms of geography and industry. The impact of remote work on. By the way, that's not to say there aren't some relevant findings there. So, okay, I'm going to speed up through this. You'll notice there's a deduping process that Moara goes through, and it's happened right here. This is already a paper that we have in here, so it's already marked as added. Okay, let me pause here and show why it's so important to tear through a lot of search results. Of course, what I need to do is read through this and screen it, but here's an example of a paper that shows up on page 4, and yet it is probably the most attractive paper I've seen on this topic yet. Yes, it's the Sustainability Journal. We can assume there might look beyond productivity, but the impact of work from home on employee performance and productivity, a systematic review. That's the exact type of review that I was talking about. Anytime you get a review paper, a systematic review, a literature review paper, that is a very great source of information. We also see that it's 217 citations, and it's fairly recent. It's at least a few years after the worst of the pandemic. So, some of those sporadic, wild different changes and factors might not be as intense. So make sure you're looking through. There's a reason I'm sort of skipping ahead on this video. You've got to make sure you're looking through a lot of results. You don't want to miss something like this. Okay, so I've now gone through, I went through 10 pages of results. And so that means I looked at 100 different results. I ended up adding 23 of them. I think that's a pretty good starting point. Now, I want to reiterate, I did this for about 20 minutes. If you're working on a major assignment research project, you should really be doing this you should be spending days and maybe even weeks on this as you continue to do it throughout your review. I did feel like as I got to page 8 and 9 of Google Scholar is when I started to see fewer and fewer very attractive studies to work on. Now, I was pretty picky. So you find out, I think in title screening, you go through a bit of a process to take a look at what's available and sort of form your judgment on the fly. Some things that I formed a judgment on is decided to not focus on any discipline specific, industry specific, or geography specific studies, really, especially ones that were not US based. I'm assuming our client is in the US. And on top of it, really did not focus much on any papers with under, say, 20 citations. Now, if you're doing a big review, again, you should be looking for those sort of diamonds in the rough, right? The needle in the haystack papers where might not be in a significant journal, might not have a lot of citations, but there's a great model in there, really cool results. It hasn't, maybe some papers that haven't been fully appreciated yet. But for now, we've got to sort of generalize as a result of deadlines and the time on this video. So that's what I'm doing. Now, so that's what I've got. I'm starting with 23 papers. Now, how to actually sort of reconcile this with undermine, there's a couple different ways to do it. The first one that comes to mind is it's probably not exactly right to do, but I want to go ahead and see, for example, how much coverage there is in the top 10 results in terms of my library. If I find that, once again, there's a significant number of, say, the top 10 results not covered here, I probably want to go through a detailed process to make sure I'm bringing undermined papers over. And indeed, you should always be using multiple search engines because we know there's very little overlap. Usually it's only about 25% overlap and the results you get between two search engines. There's always new papers. So how many of the below papers do I have covered in my review? And let's see if that copies in nicely. Okay, let's give that a shot and see what we get. 2 of 10 papers covered. Not yet covered. Systematic review on remote work. All right, let's look through this. All right, so teleworking and labor productivity, remote work for executives. Honestly, in this case, there's many different ways you could do this. Everyone will do it differently. I'm just going to do a quick kind of title screening here. So remote work for executives, I think that's something I'm less interested in. Specific policies, maybe not enormously important. Telework productivity drivers, that one looks very interesting. Work family conflict, work from home. Okay, so let me at least bring in a few of these. And if I had time, what I would actually do is a formal reconciliation of all of these. Probably what I'll do just once again, in the interest of time is we've got Prasad. I'm going to go ahead and download this PDF. Okay. And let's make sure, let's try to, just kind of a random target, get our number here to 30. I've already covered quite a bit of pre-pandemic papers. So that was the other thing I was looking at was I actually really would prioritize recency in this case because we know pre-pandemic, just very different world. The technologies we use, we weren't using Zoom, very different world. Throughout the thick of the pandemic, we had the, significant changes at the home, for example. So I really would love papers that are, let's say, 2023 and later. Remote work for executives, no, probably not. It says it was. I think this one looks very interesting. To Pasco. Here, one second. Let's go back to our files. Whoops. All papers, and it looks like that one was right here. Drivers of telework. So that's interesting that this actually showed up. Telework productivity. Nonetheless, what I'm going to do is go ahead and just grab that title. I'll add it this way. There are different ways to do this. I don't believe there's a way to do sort of a Chrome extension on the Undermine site, but for now, everyone can figure out different ways to add papers to their table. Let me grab that and maybe grab one more. Work from home and well-being. There were a couple studies that focused on, again, for instance, well-being. I think we're more focused on productivity. And then this is all very informal, but let me just say selection treatment in the market for remote work. Interesting. So that result is good, not great. Improves retention without damaging performance. Hybrid work from home. Let's take a look and see if we have this one, because that is once again going back to that topic. So we do. Okay. Okay. For now, we're going to go ahead and exit out of Undermine. However, I'll reiterate Undermine, Research Rabbit. There are a lot of different tools. For that matter, your library A to Z list resources like EBSCO. You should be going through all these tools. Search is going to be a very messy process. It's going to take time. And so I recommend sort of really going for it there. Now, so here we are. We have 24 papers. Ideally, you will all be working with more like a couple hundred papers if it's your dissertation, whatever. Question is what to do next. A lot of different things you could do here. Many people like to tag their papers, break out data. At a high level, next thing to do is screening. And I think there are different kind of the main question we have to get to is how do we feel like we have a good handle on this area of research? There are a couple different approaches to that. The one I used to say was, especially when you were doing full text reviews primarily, I used to say when you start to run into references of papers you've already read, that's how you feel like you have a pretty good handle on things. In this case, what I'm going to say is this. If we review these 24 papers, say, or let's say you have a library of 100, and you review the first 30, and you feel like there are very few discrepancies, there's a set of consistent themes going through these papers that the same empirical findings, in short, such as the relative effectiveness of hybrid work environment. That's when you should feel like you have a pretty good handle on the research. Yes, there's going to be some papers with some really cool things here and there, but the further you go, getting the same results, the more likely it is that some paper that has a contradicting result, you'd have to really look into it to validate it because it could have just used a bad model or bad data sources. So I hate to say trust the consensus because it's a very important thing and an important contribution to challenge the consensus. But in our case, if we're reporting on the literature to a client, that's how I'm going to do it. And I am going to specifically order this by citation count. I'm actually not sure how this one ended up here, but I would like to sort by citation count and sort of work through that way. And I'm trying to decide exactly how I'll go about this. Sort by A to Z. There's a few different ways you can do it in Moara, by the way. You can actually just scroll through like this. I think what I will probably do is, just to keep it simple, I'm going to mark the first, I want to mark my first 10 as high priority. In fact, let me just say set priority as high. Okay, so we can see that's updated here. Let me go ahead and go into screening. Now, what I want to do in screening here is filter for high priority papers. And then in the main library page, there's a lot you can do here with the agent, with the enrichments button, where you can actually add enrichments and make sure. So here's an example of an enrichment. Yes, no, maybe. So I can say something like check for productivity focus. Include only papers that you could even say something like specifically mention productivity or a related term in their abstracts. If you want to be really explicit, now I could say studies that focus on productivity, but then there's a lot of judgment the LLMs are doing. If I want to be really specific, I'm going to say, is it in the abstract? And if it's not, it's probably not a main focus of the study. So it's a pretty good indicator. Include only papers that specifically mention productivity related to in their abstracts. Exclude ones that don't. Pretty straightforward. And then for these, I'm going to do include and exclude. Now, ideally, you'd put unsure as well, but what I'd rather do, just for in the interest of time, is have our LLMs just kind of force categorize these. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. You don't have to do this, but just in case I want to sort of whittle down my universe, especially if I'm working with a lot of studies, whittle down my universe of studies I actually have to pour through. This is what I would do. So I'm going to let this run and take a sip of coffee while it is. Okay. All right, so we've got all our results. And then look, all I'm going to do here is probably filter down for excludes. Okay. And then within exclude, anything that happens to be tagged high. Okay, good news. Nothing's tagged high. So that's good news. What I was going to say was I'm going to go ahead and prioritize these. Oh, excuse me. Forgot we weren't using tags, we're using priorities. So several of these are priorities. Let me just get a sense for these, by the way. I'm going to go ahead and move this to medium row so I can read through this a bit. Examine how it impacts organizational performance, moderate by organizational policy. So I'm fine marking that as low because not only is it not solely focused on performance, now this is still productivity. That's probably part of this, but also has a little bit of a additional factor, right? Studying policies, management support. So a little bit more complicated. Workforce dynamics and new working models. Little complicated. Sounds management-esque. Could be helpful, but not in this. Work on remote works experiments long-term effects and future implication on hiring and remote work trends. Good example of something that I don't think gets at our core research problem. Firm-wide remote work led to static and siloed collaboration networks. I do find that interesting. So here's all I'm going to do. Abstract missing here. Ideally, I'll take the time to fill that in. I'm going to go ahead and prioritize these as low. I'm going to pick that one, prioritize as medium, because I did mention collaboration, innovation. I want to understand some of those factors as well. So all that said, let's move back to screening. We're going to filter for high priority. And then I will once again reiterate what we're trying to do is establish patterns. Those patterns are very likely to align with the ones we came up with in our Claude, summary. So let's establish patterns. There are different ways to do this. I'll reiterate. You can do this in enrichments. You can ask questions in the agent. I'm going to read through them. So please give me some time to read through, and I'll skip ahead. What I'm going to do though is I'll go through a couple examples and then scroll through the rest. If you want, you can assign a co-author here. You can also tag. You can add notes, and I will. So I'm going to add notes to all of the papers I'm screening. And if something's a high priority, I'll leave it. And if it's not, I'll check it off. So in this first one, drivers of telework, worker productivity, systematic review, really love that. Identify the factors influencing teleworker productivity by reviewing empirical evidence found in the scientific literature. I read that first sentence and one thing worries me, and that is that it does not appear to be a study of the effects of telework on productivity. It appears to be a study focused specifically on productivity within teleworkers. Maybe that's why it was lower in the search results, you'll recall. So in this case, gather and evaluate. Let me confirm that's the focus of this study. Heterogeneous, narrow in scope, telework significantly impacts productivity, with its effects varying based on intensity, the nature of the task performed, individual. Okay, so based on that sentence, that initial instinct could be wrong. This manuscript provides, this might be actually something that search engine took a look, decided that my concern about it was what the topic was about. In fact, there could be some really good data here. Comprehensive review of the factors influencing teleworker productivity, analyzing 318 research articles to identify the key determinants of productivity in remote work environments. Okay, look, taken together, I read through this abstract and I say, this is not primarily a study of the effects of telework on productivity. In fact, my instinct is maybe it is a literature review done in the paper rather than a big, say, econometric model or regression model done on that topic. Seems to be, as I mentioned, much more focused on providing a comprehensive review of the factors influencing teleworker productivity. I'm going to go ahead and mark this as medium. And the note I will put in is more focused on teleworker productivity than overall productivity effects of telework. So if our client's question was, how do we make our work from home employees more productive? This would be the golden study, but that's not what we're really after. So I'll mark it as medium because we know there's going to be some data in there that's important to us. And the reason it's important to put notes, of course, is that we will come back to it when we go through our medium reviews. I'm going to click Save and Next. Let's do one more. Evolution of work from home. I included this because broad titles like this with highly cited papers, let's take a look at what the citation count is, 687. Even though it seems broad, it's just kind of based on my experiences. These tend to be the really great seminal papers. I don't know why. Really, even though it's not like the effects of this on that, it could have some really good theory, could have a really good introduction with a good literature review. These tend to be good papers, but let's read the abstract to find out. Full days worked at home account for 28% of paid workdays among. So right off the bat, we don't want summary statistics, right? That's not the study we're looking for. That's 4 times the 2019 rate. Okay, so this is more describing the importance of the study. We first explained why the big shift to work from home has endured rather than reverted to pre-pandemic levels. We then considered how work from home rates vary. We also discussed some implications for pay, productivity. Okay, right there. That's all I need to read. This is a secondary thought, right? We also discuss some implications for productivity. That is my primary focus. I am bringing this down actually to low. The reason I'm bringing it to low is really appears to me that A, it's a macroeconomic study rather than something that would be great from a client perspective. B, the key contribution appears to be the trend analysis, if you will, the summary statistics of work from home numbers over time. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that, and I'm going to say more about trend analyses and summary stats versus, say, sort of causal effects, studying causal effects, if you will, or again, regression modeling, for example. Click Save and Next. Let's see if we can come across one of these high important studies. This is, I guess, why you can't really sort and prioritize by citation count alone. The impact of work from home on employee productivity, performance, and productivity. Hard to imagine this won't be a good one. Let me take a look at what year, 2023, right in the money. During the COVID-19, work from home has unquestionably become one of the most important extensively employed techniques. However, the impacts of work from home on employee productivity and performance is not fully known. Studies on the subject are fragmented in different contexts. Purpose of this study is therefore to provide systematic review on the impact of work from home on employee productivity and performance. Yep, golden. Now, because I know this is a good abstract, I want to read it as well, because title and abstract screening is not just about figuring out what to include and exclude. It's also about starting to do the review. Okay, you can learn a lot by reading through, say, the Claude summary, undermine summary, whatever. You can learn even more by actually diving into the abstracts and getting into the meat of it. And then, of course, you become a real expert when you get into the thick of full text reviews. So let's look at this. I'm going to read the rest and then I'll skip ahead. A sample of 26 studies out of 112 potential studies. So yes, it's a systematic review. Were used after a comprehensive, boiled down to 26 studies, basically doing what we're doing. Don't be afraid to, from a client work perspective, we know we're probably going to rely like crazy on this paper. It's really always comes down to whether or not we're doing a huge synthesis or do we pick a few papers that are highly cited, incredibly reliable, that we can actually rely on significantly. We might have a whole PowerPoint presentation on one paper. This is a candidate for that in the context of client work. In your papers, it's a little more subtle if you're doing a dissertation or something, but maybe this does deserve a lot of attention and everything sort of builds from this in your literature review. Sample of 26 studies out of 112 potential studies used. Okay, findings reveal that the impact of work from home model on employee productivity and performance depend on a host of factors: nature of the work, employer and industry characteristics, and home settings. Majority reporting a positive impact and few documenting no difference or a negative impact. This study recommends that an improvement in technology and information technology training and capacity building would yield more who are willing to do. Okay, so one thing I'm going to do is reread that, that's for sure. Because this contradicts, as far as I could tell from that first reading, I'm just doing this on the fly, contradicts everything we've heard so far. What we've heard is the hybrid model is the best. Work from home, especially in some initial studies, recall from Claude and Undermine, especially in early studies, we saw that full remote work is not good for productivity, a little bit murkier, but not good for productivity. But we know it's good for instance, employee satisfaction. But this runs counter to one of our key findings. So let me read it again. Findings from those studies reveal that the impact of the work from home model on productivity depend on a host of factors. Nature of the work we know is important. Employer and industry characteristics in home settings. Majority reporting a positive impact and few documenting no difference or negative impact. There is, this is what we're looking for, right? We're looking for a highly cited study, figure out why exactly that highly studied study has a finding that runs counter to the summaries we came across. And probably, my guess would be, knowing how those LLMs work, runs counter to the newspaper articles, runs counter to the board presentations that executive committee teams are using to make decisions. And for that matter, that maybe public policymakers are using to make their decisions. So that's going to be very, very important. Excellent reference. Main finding appears to run counter to initial scoping reviews finding positive effects of work from home versus semi-negative effects in these summaries. Now, one thing I'll say is I don't mean to kind of over-engineer this or overemphasize it. What could be the case is simply that those other studies look at hybrid, full remote, and in person fully. And then this one could be binary, right? It could be, or it could be something along the lines of a 1% sort of comparative, a 1% increase in work from home. All right, let's move on here. We saved those notes. And now I'm going to go through the rest of my review and skip ahead. Okay, so let me pause and mention one thing here. I came to this paper, Effective Remote Work on Firm Level Productivity. Looks like a great approach. So it uses a difference in difference approach. It appears to be kind of an econometric study, a macroeconomic study. We haven't seen too many of those yet. A lot of management-like studies, a lot of surveys, etc. So this looks great. The results appear to really confirm some of the findings that we had in mind beforehand. Here's the issue you run into, which is one citation, and then the journal itself is a university journal, effectively a preprint. And so in that case, different people might have different ways of dealing with this. I know what I'm doing is I don't want to single this person out, but I'm looking at the author and I want to see, is this someone who's there might be different ways of doing this, but again, is this someone who's a reputable faculty member? Is it a student, whatever? I was not able to find much information on this author. It appears this person might have been a student. So I know it's kind of a unfortunate part of screening, but we just don't have time in many cases to read through every single paper. So I think if you come across an abstract that's really great and very, very important, we have, for example, with clients in the past, used graduate theses, actually not even dissertation, graduate paper theses that had a lot of great models and data. In this case, though, I'm going to mark it as maybe medium or low, just because we don't have the signals you get from either being a university faculty member, citation count, journals, etc. So there are different ways you have to go about screening when you don't have some of those important signals. Let me take another pause on this paper right here. What's really interesting is this. When we went through our summaries, one of the first things we found is that one of the most well-supported findings apparently was hybrid work environments, hybrid work arrangements being incredibly effective in terms of boosting productivity relative to full work from home or full in person, which seems plausible. What's interesting is this is actually all the papers I've screened so far, this is the first one I've come across that really discusses this topic. And what's more, the study methodology is mostly focused on, or almost is entirely focused on surveys. Now that's not to say that's not reliable, but it'd be really interesting to see. I mean, rather than forming any conclusions, or we can certainly come up with some hypotheses about whether or not that is an overstated part of the summary. But even rather than doing that, one thing I will say is goes back to the point of always needing to be adding additional literature. As I go through this, what I'm thinking is, okay, what I'm going to have to do after this is come up with a search that specifically looks at hybrid environments. Maybe it's named something different. For one reason or another, we did not capture it in this search, it seems. So I just wanted to call that out. I am going to mark this as high for two reasons. One is because it covers the hybrid arrangement. And then the second is actually really interesting, and that is that it challenges prior literature on the topic. So I want to talk again about the conflicting evidence here. The Claude summary we got and the undermined summary indicated that earlier studies had talked about how full work from home, or I should say, there's a little bit of literature to indicate full work from home has negative effects. That was in the summary. Now, two of the big, most highly cited papers we've seen in this screening process indicated that there were positive effects those papers found in terms of work from home on productivity. That's always going to be an interesting point, right? To sort of look into the merits of those arguments in terms of it challenging prior papers. There's clearly a big literature review element to this. And I think it's really interesting, and it speaks a little bit to also, you've got to keep in mind some of the motivations of the authors. But biggest takeaway here, I've got to go out and find my own, do a new search for hybrid working environments. Okay, so I've finished going about my screening, and of the let's see, 24 papers, a very small number, 24 papers we started with, I am left with 8 that are high priority. I feel like that's a fairly good representation of a typical screening process, particularly systematic reviews. I recently covered an example where I think there were 5,000 citations they started with, and they boiled them down to like 90 or something, but that's a little extreme. I think when it comes to title and abstract screening for a typical review, 8 of 24, maybe 1/4, 1/3 will be high priority. You can still go through screening for medium priority. Any ones you mark low, I think you can mostly set those aside. Maybe you want to plug them into your agent, ask some questions, and see if there's some interesting information there. But I would go through title and abstract screening for high and medium primarily. But let's start with high. And again, I just want to, there's so many different ways I can jump into this now. I guess first things first, let's make sure we have all of our full text articles, which it seems we don't in every case. So I'm just going to quickly go through a process to grab all of these. Okay, so now we've got all our full text articles. For reference, thanks to there are different ways to do this, but thanks to the LibKey access that I have through George Washington University, able to grab and import those in with about 30 seconds of time each. And so this took 2 to 3 minutes. I just went right through the LibKey access. It was mostly a 2-click process. In some cases, you had to actually go to the publisher site. All depends on the licenses. And one thing I'll mention is most of the papers here I added via Google Scholar, you'll recall. I had 3 that already were uploaded, full text articles. And what that tells me, by the way, is only 3 of the 5 seminal papers called out on Claude I actually kept when I went through title and abstract screening, not realizing which were which. Okay, so now we have all of our documents, and that's what's important. I am going to once more filter for priority, and then I know something I'm just curious to take a look at is this. Right now we have, okay, all of these. I'm curious about one thing, and that is positive v negative effects. Of course, I could read this quickly, but just, especially if you're working with a larger library, it could be helpful. Um, classify, indicate whether the study finds positive or negative effects of work from home, remote work on productivity. Yet again, I'm going to go ahead and just give 2 options, positive and negative. Just curious. I went through it, a lot of different ways to classify remote work, in-person work, hybrid. I was losing it a bit throughout. And so I just want to see what the consensus kind of looks like here. Okay. So, I mean, this is fascinating. I'm surprised to see all of them positive. Now, what we really need to do is get into the question of what does positive mean? The 2 dimensions as I went through title and abstract screening that were most interesting to me were, are they survey based, which in my view, survey results tend to be, of course, not in my view. I think objectively, survey results are less reliable than empirical results, albeit other than when you have some empirical models that really are a stretch and a little bit different, very really have to reach to find statistically significant results. But surveys are a little bit tough. The other thing I'd say once again is there were some studies that clearly looked at maybe full work from home versus full in person. That's going to be very different than one that looks at, say, a 1% increase in, or a more accurate unit I saw was a one working day increase in work from home. So you could hypothetically say from 0 to 1, you might see a productivity improvement, 0 to 1 work from home day. But from 4 to 5, that is from 4 days a week to the whole week work from home, that was going to be a very different relationship. So that's really what we need to flesh out here in this full text review. I want to reiterate one more thing, and that is if we were doing this in full, I would absolutely be typing in things like effects of hybrid work. I'd find some way to word it. Maybe I'd work with the agent to figure out a search strategy, but hybrid work environment on productivity. And then here's one other thing you can do that I think is really helpful because only one of the papers we marked as high priority actually mentioned this particular topic. The one other thing I could do is go into the initial summary. Hybrid arrangements, I mean, this is right up front, appears to be close to a free lunch. Very simple. Give me the sources you got this from, or however you want to word it. And let's see if we can get some links and papers that we should have otherwise included. Hybrid working benefits and challenges for productivity and performance. If I had time, I would put a bunch of these in. I will grab a couple of them and take a quick look at their abstracts. Case study in Agile. Don't want a case study. And let me just kind of survey this. I mean, by the way, common sense is important. Common sense tells me a hybrid work environment probably is, I've said it many times, probably is a really great arrangement. I think that is a very good balance to strike. However, the negative in my life is that I'm all or nothing. This is not scientific literature, but for me, it really is the case. I'm either working from home and have a great routine at home, or I'm always at the office. Because if I work at the office 4 days and try to work from home one day, I just know me. I'm folding laundry. I'm doing all sorts of crazy things. So there is an intuitive case, or there's a hypothetical theory and rationale for this not making a lot of sense. But hybrid work leadership balancing subsequent sections articulate. Let me add that because it looks relevant. It's got 23 citations. I can't really figure it out, and that's why it's so important to have the abstracts being enriched on Moara because we only get these little snippets from Google Scholar and from a lot of the search engines we use. So this is interesting. I'm actually also very kind of excited to see what's going on here. Hybrid working from home improves retention without damaging performance. CNBC article. Here's a Wiley article. Meta-analysis. The meta-analysis found remote working intensity. Okay, I want these. I want to take a look at these. The SN Business Systematic Review. I want that. The phrase close to free. Notice again, you've got to be constantly getting papers, and if you should really be hungry to find sources that add to your library, that support arguments, that contradict arguments. You got to really be hungry for them. That is search strategy. Search strategy, in my view, is not a 3-step approach and then you're done. It's like an intense, constant grind for papers. Just these caveats could be interesting. The phrase close to free lunch, yeah, that's fine. 2 to 3 days at home specification comes mostly from trip.com study design. So I mentioned that up top. I don't find that interesting. Strongest for university educated knowledge workers. That's not that surprising. I should note that as productive as is supported for measurable output. So these are just caveats. They're important, but let's see, by the way, gets into the secondary research, right? We know, so that's referencing a nature study. And let's get the nature study. The 3-day is a win-win-win according to a study published in Nature. Okay, that's the summary. So oftentimes the university itself will publish a summary of the a summary of the article. If we you should all on your topics read through things like that. You should know as much as you can. You should have read every frickin' article about your topic to the extent possible. Provide concrete. I'm looking for the nature link, and there it is. Hybrid work from home improves retention without damaging performance. We have that in our library. Let's take a look for it. Retention. Hybrid work from home. Okay, so this is the one that's in our library. I mean, this goes to, by the way, I had mentioned it's probably, I'd like to think I sort of nailed it. I had mentioned it's probably 5 sources covering this. Looks like that maybe it's 10. But the point is, it's really maybe 1 or 2 sources, especially, that are getting this. So that's already included. I had already mentioned some issues I have with this, which is specifically that it's survey based, asking employees questions about how productive they are work from home. You always get sort of certain biases in surveys. Okay, so that's the source of that. We already have this covered. Hybrid is the future of work. As far as I know, that is the summary of that survey. So these are survey results. I was curious. Those are survey results. Let's cover these second 2 that are mentioned in Claude. The impact of remote and hybrid work models on small, medium-sized enterprise productivity, systematic literature review, undertakes of the impact of remote. Okay, so I'm just doing the abstract here, of course. Undertakes a systematic literature, the impacts of remote and hybrid work models on the productivity using the preferred reporting items. Data were collected. Final sample of 12 peer-reviewed studies. Okay, we definitely want this. A little bit of a, you could call it I guess it's a systematic review. Let's make sure we add that. And before I even forget, whoops, I'm going to jump in, add that paper, and make sure it's marked as high priority to be included in our full text reviews. While that's running, we'll look at this. As the COVID-19 pandemic, okay, 2024, a dual pathway model of remote work intensity, meta-analysis, okay. So this is, you can see the framing, which I view as important, that organizations asking employees to return, employees, however, don't want to return. I think that, frankly, is a motivator for some of the conclusions, for example, especially in the website articles, you'll find news articles and whatnot. All right. Remote work intensities effects. RWA, the effectiveness of remote work ranging from 1 or 2 days a week to full-time remote work. Propose a dual pathway model linking RWI to employee outcomes. Okay. Findings from a meta-analysis of RWI's effects based on 108 studies. So we want this. Let me go ahead and read through the effects. Allowing organizations, RWI had overall small but beneficial effects on multiple consequential employee outcomes. Meta-analysis of the effects of remote work use, a binary construct, remote works versus office. Findings based on 60. Remote workers generally have better outcomes than their office-based colleagues. Findings suggest that remote work offers modest upsides even for those. Okay, so one thing I don't see here, which I'll reiterate, this was referenced when I had asked about what supports the hybrid point. Review find that hybrid models. I don't see much about the hybrid model. I will nonetheless grab this PDF. Okay, I can't get it there, so I'm going to try to get it through my lib key. Come back to Moara. Add this, and I'm going to let these, I'll let this run. I'm going to make sure this is marked as high priority. You'll notice I dragged over the priority column from the end, which is where it sometimes lives, to right here. I'm not using tags at the moment. And then just to stay consistent, let's go back to, we should have now 3 papers that are unscreened. So I'm going to go through these quickly. Okay, so I've now finished my screening of even those new papers that hypothetically are more focused on hybrid work environments. I think I added 2 to high priority. And then here's what's crucial. So now we've done our priority lists. Going forward, it'll be more about filtering for those. But what's important now, too, is I not only have the priority list, but I have, or at least in this case, reviewed already on Nature page, highly relevant. That's the one I missed because I marked it as high priority right when it came in. Otherwise, I have all of the notes for, in short, include, exclude. These are the ones that I did not initially mark as high priority because of their citation counts, but I otherwise would mark those as that way. So priority levels, notes for those. This gives you a lot of, it's kind of reproducible, if you will. It gives you a lot of support. I will tell you how, once again, title and abstract screening is not just about prioritizing include, exclude decisions. It's also about deciding it's also about coming up with a little bit of a starting point in terms of evidence synthesis, working on your hypotheses, figuring out how your own assumptions are being challenged, how others' assumptions are being challenged. One of the big assumptions that appears to be being challenged for me is that there seems to be a seminal paper on hybrid work arrangements. It was written about in Stanford, Stanford on Stanford's website. It was written about by CNBC. It therefore has gotten a lot of attention, a lot of citations, and it showed up very prominently, therefore, in our Claude output and in our undermine output. That is an example of maybe a finding that is over exaggerated, overemphasized, not as well supported as it seems. These are the types of hypotheses I should be creating as I go through title and abstract screening. I'll also note one other thing. This is a long video, of course. Title and abstract screening for those 28 papers took me, I would say I spent 30 seconds on each, maybe 45 seconds on each. And so if you're going through a literature screening process for a major project, as I keep mentioning, for a dissertation, not for a 1 week client deliverable, there's no reason you shouldn't be doing formal title and abstract screening. Yes, you can use filters to prioritize. You can use things like citation counts, but title and abstract screening, you learn a lot, and it allows you to get good coverage over everything. And again, you document your exact decisions for including and excluding studies. And so I highly recommend, I think that's something researchers should be doing more often, is formal, documented title and abstract screening. Okay, so now we got to get into full text reviews. And what we should really be doing is specifically reading through the articles that we marked as high priority. Now, what I would recommend for this, there are many different, as always, ways to do it. You can open the PDFs, whatever. What I'd recommend is using our annotations feature. That's at least the best way to go through full text articles. I'll mention a couple others that you might want to consider. I won't really cover them in depth here. I'm going to focus on some core ones, but the synthesis report could be interesting. I'll let that run. If you run the synthesis report, you'll get back top methodologies, top findings. I'd be really interested to compare that. That is, top methodologies, findings across our library, to compare it with some of the summaries and articles we'd seen before, especially if you looked at a lot of secondary research. So I'll let that run. We've got our bibliography. I think that's always going to be important. We have something called AI writing. I won't cover it right now. What I'd actually like to do is work in Word so that everyone can sort of have accessibility to the tool. But I think that's interesting. Synthesis report, have a learn on quantitative methods. Research design, surveys and meta-analyses dominate the landscape. Cross-sectional surveys surveyed 30,000 Americans to assess the persistence of work from home. Meta-analyses synthesize existing studies. So I want to reiterate something. A lot of these, including the meta-analyses and systematic reviews, are based on survey results. It appears that it's a little bit hard to find econometric studies based on observational, actual data. And in fact, one of the ones that we had, you'll recall, we screened out because it was written by an author that wasn't a faculty member. We couldn't get a handle on the journal. There weren't really many citations, but this might be a good example. If you're looking at this and you're thinking there's a lot of survey data, we've seen in many other fields how literature evolves as you move from survey data to observational data. Oftentimes, whatever the effects are you find in survey data, in short, they're condensed significantly in observational data. It goes from massive effects to zero. So the point is, if I'm doing a big review, I would take this time after I review this synthesis report to hunt down whatever actual, let's say, revealed observational data studies I can find. That is doing things like looking at it's a very hard thing to do, but macroeconomic work from home rates and their effects on overall economic productivity, or maybe industry level industrial output. There are different ways you can do this where it's not based on surveys. My guess is those are less well supported. They're less voluminous, so you've got fewer of them, and there aren't as many that are well cited. But That would be a really cool area, little pocket of literature to look into. That's my instinct. So those are the methodologies. Key findings indicates that remote and hybrid works generally enhance productivity. Employee well-being, I think that one is not a very controversial issue. It seems to me that is an example of something you can get from survey results, right? So I think that's a lot different. Though the impact varies based on job type, hybrid work models improve employee retention and maintain performance levels. So that's that one article. Remote work flexibility is associated with organizational performance, especially when, I should mention, this synthesis report is not weighted necessarily for high priority papers. Work from home have led to a significant increase in productivity for routine tasks, but may decrease productivity for non-routine. The shift to remote work has resulted in sustained increase in work from home days. Okay, so the reason this synthesis report at the moment isn't great for us, this is more, I think, if you build a library and then you need a quick read on it. We've gone through title and abstract screening, so just like our Claude output, I mean, we go back to this. I really mean it when I say we are already smarter than this output. And we've already highlighted some of the ways why. So you want to become an expert, you get into the literature, even just the abstract level. Let's not delay it though. Let's get into the full text articles. And I'm going to go ahead and filter, sort added first, filter. Okay, so at the moment, here's an example of something on our site. We actually don't have filter for high priority. So very simple workaround. And you can always find little workarounds like this. Let me filter for, go ahead and filter for priority high, just like the little kind of tricks you do in a spreadsheet. We can't account for every condition. And so what I'm going to do is mark all of these to me. My username is research space for some random reason. So that's me. I'm going to go to annotations and I'm going to click assign to me. And now I just have the high priority papers, right? Pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to run through. Now I should mention, if we had the time, I would say I would advise you to actually use our annotations feature. So how do you use annotations? Well, it's pretty simple. You find a little snippet you find interesting in the study. You can click annotate. You can comment on that, tag it, then you can save it down. That annotation actually gets saved as a piece of text, and then you can export that later. And it comes along with your paper ID and paper information. So you can actually, again, you highlight, the text gets extracted, and you can export it later on with your in-text citation. So it's really helpful. For the moment, here's what I'm going to do. Rather than just reading through the full paper on this video, I will describe my process, and I think it's the process most go through for full text reviews. I will probably do something like this, which is for each paper, I'm going to read through title and abstract to make sure I remember which one it is. So systematic review of the impact of remote hybrid working models, productivity of small, medium-sized enterprises. Yep. Hybrid remote and hybrid working models. Impact is so this is one of the recent ones I added. Comprehensive suggestion of critical success factors. I had marked this one as hybrid models emerged as the most effective as they combine the independence of remote work. Okay, so there are 12 peer-reviewed studies. I do recall this one. I had marked this one in my include-exclude criteria, or excuse me, my screening notes as a little bit more focused on the strategies you can actually take to improve the productivity of remote workers. But because it focused on the hybrid model, and because that was so important in our initial summary, I did include this as well. So that's the first thing I'm doing. Title abstract. Okay, yes, that's this study. Ideally, I can get a handle on the authors as well. That's good to know. And I'm just curious to see University of Malaysia. Okay. Curious to see now, I'd say there are really three parts of the study that are super important. Of course, there's more, but you have your intro, which is very important. You have your, methodology, I think is important for your most critical studies. I'm usually looking for some kind of discussion. There it is, discussion section, and then conclusions as well. Conclusions, I mostly covered in, and let's see if there even is a conclusion section. Limitation of future research. Conclusions I mostly cover in the abstract, actually. Yes, there's a lot more nuances here, but those are the three sections I care most about. Introduction, not only because introduction has a couple things of interest. One is a good summary of the paper, almost like repeating the abstract and describing the findings, but the other is its own literature review. So it's almost like looking through abstracts again. Usually the introduction has a really nice, even more so than a literature review section, introduction is going to have a really nice narrative description of prior literature, the importance of the topic. I think it's a great section to start with. So I'm going to read through that, and then I'm going to probably jump to the discussion section. and then probably jump to conclusions. So those are the three I'm going to go through. I'm going to annotate throughout, maybe take some notes on a separate document. You'll notice I have not started my writing yet. A lot of people will advise you to start writing throughout your review. Um, a lot of people, for instance, put outlines together. That is not what I'm going to do. I prefer to get all of my data put together before I actually go through writing. So let me just say, full text article reviews, that's going to be your most time intensive. It's going to be hard to do on a short video or short video like this, but that's going to be my process, right? Intro, discussion, conclusion. Eventually, there are some papers like maybe that one systematic review that looked awesome. If I really love that, I'm going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read it a couple times. So that's my guidance. Right now, what I'm going to actually do is jump to a different paper. That one is a high priority, but it's a low high priority, if you will. What I want to do is walk through a demo on a paper that we know is really, really great. And actually, let me go back to screening. Give me 1 second here. So let's filter for high priority, and let's find one I really like. So excellent reference, main findings appeared around. Okay. Impact of work from home on employee productivity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Impact of work from home, employee performance, productivity, systematic review. That one was the one we pointed to and said, we could maybe have this be kind of our own seminal, the paper we really focus on. Back to work from home on employee performance and productivity. Here it is. Let me just fire through the intro and see if there's anything I want to call out specifically. Change the world, introducing new social expectations and ways of living. I don't find the setup to be incredibly important. I think that will stand the test of time, right? Someday someone might read this in 10, 20, 100 years, and they'll understand the context through which this paper was prepared. And I think that is important. At the moment, I'm sort of skimming through that pretty quickly. 59 countries mandate public workers carry out their job-related tasks, duties. Okay, here's where we actually get in the literature review. And again, it's just this is, think of the Claude summary we did. This is a more reliable summary. Now the difference is it is a more reliable and detailed summary because we know someone entrenched in the literature prepared this. Differences might not be as recent, so it might miss some studies, and it might be really specific to the research question the author is working on. But nonetheless, I would much rather, for instance, a researcher prepared review paper on a topic, even that's a couple years old, than the summary, LLM type summary you get. So it's really great to read through this. Ref 15 reports the impacts of work from home on productivity remains unknown. Some experts think teleworking could be suitable for working life. Letting employees work from home shows that company has a human-centered strategic vision. I mean, these are the types of things that really would get ironed out in a good empirical study that's based on observational data. But we got to work with what we got. During the COVID-19 crisis, discovered a beneficial influence on the productivity of call center staff. This is a bit more of I'd prefer a little more synthesis. This is more listing references, but you want to be an expert on your topic, and so you should read through these things. Noted that work from home has many disadvantages, including an absence of supervision. Yep. These are sort of theory based, the negative aspects of it. So, look, I think as I'm reading through this, I'm thinking to myself, it's very clear that there are positive and negative effects, and you can make very good arguments for both. I, once again, am doubling down on my interest in empirical research on this topic. There are many areas in which theory is incredibly useful, and just kind of listing out pros and cons, incredibly useful. This isn't one of them, or at least it's semi-useful. The point is, I want numbers, right? I want empirical studies. I want to understand the methodologies. That's what I'm after. So I'm taking these with a little bit of a grain of salt. One of the identified in their study, communication, okay, stated that work from home has been demonstrated to be equally demonstrated. There's an empirical study, equally advantageous and negatively impacts product. Work from home has been demonstrated to be equally advantageous and negatively impacts productivity. It's a bit of a strange phrase. Depending on abilities, as reference 20 also reported that physical health moderates work from home productivity effect, and muscular issues are frequently mentioned as a concern with work from home. Is a novel concept, okay. The history I'm less concerned about. Based on these, this paper provides a systematic review on how the remote work paradigm affected employee productivity during the COVID-19 pandemic. Following research question will be addressed. Does work from home influence productivity performance? What are the factors? Okay, those are the key things. Next thing I'm doing right away, I'm going to jump to, you know what? You might want to jump to discussion. I'm going to go ahead and look through findings as well. You got to make all sorts of calculations. The only way to understand how to navigate a paper is to read through a ton of them. And so in this case, look, we've got limited time. Findings is too long. I'm going to go to the discussion. That's where the kind of rubber meets the road. So work from home is recommended as a public health safety, might be a risk factor. Productivity of workers is an essential component of any organization that operates regardless of whether the organization is public, commercial, or private entity. Findings show that work from home may result in both positive and negative job outcomes on a host of factors. Okay, I'm going to reread this. I skimmed over it too quickly. Implications. Findings show that work from home may result in both positive and negative job outcomes on a host of factors. Nature of work, for instance, while few documented no difference or a negative impact. For instance, in their study, at this point, I'm interested in the synthesis, right? I'm less interested in specific studies, but let's just see what's covered here. Academic researchers in tertiary were more productive with the work from home model than working in an office. Additionally, the authors documented that about 70% out of the 704 researchers believe they would be, there are survey results, equally or more productive in the future if they could spend more time working from home at the workspace. I mean, let me state the obvious. The reason why, in my view, you have to take those with a grain of salt is because we've already seen that employee satisfaction goes up significantly. It is significantly improved by work from home. I think there are just many reasons. That's one of them. The other has to do with, of course, work from home pretty unequivocally being more equitable for instance, people with kids. I think you've always got to take certain findings with a grain of salt. Understand even the cultural elements and how it's viewed in society. All of these things affect even scientific researchers writing papers objectively or trying to write objectively. At the workspace, they're better collaborating with colleagues. Consequently, employees are more productive with work from home, given work that does not require collaboration with others. So collaboration, that is a common theme, right? Collaboration. I feel like we've seen that elsewhere. If I was taking the time to annotate all of this, I'd annotate that and pull it out. We've seen a couple different studies mentioning that collaboration is, of course, more difficult for work from home, but less productive with work that requires it. I mean, strikes me as, based on everything we've seen so far, a very reasonable finding. This is confirmed who reported that productivity results from a combination of internal performance, personal characteristics matter. Okay, here's the deal. As I'm reading through this, it's a constant calculation as to how important this paper is, how important it is not. I still argue it's high priority. However, it's clear this is more a systematic review to come up with kind of descriptive findings. If we are looking for a number, that is the percentage impact of a 1% increase in work from home on productivity, this ain't what we're looking for. So I'm going to quickly skim through the rest of this, and then I'm jumping into another paper. I'm probably going to be spending a little bit more time in my next paper. I'm probably going to look at the methodology, in fact, because I want to see the extent to which quantitative results are being estimated. In fact, in this case, I want to see if there's a table with quantitative results. Looks like there's not. Here's a nice opportunity to go back to my library. If I had a very large library, I might jump into Enrich and I might say quantitative results, and I might say present concisely. Tell me any quantitative results from these papers to answer the question, what are the effects of remote work on productivity in, let's say, I don't know, quantitative terms. Let me just reemphasize quantitative terms. I don't want to say percentage because it might be a different unit. So quantitative terms. A conclusion I might be coming to is that the literature is not tremendously conclusive. It's much less conclusive on every aspect of this than we anticipated. And not only is it not conclusive, not only are there, for instance, conflicting studies, there's very little quantitative work that appears to have been done outside of, again, some survey results. Remote work. Let's expand our rows to large. and let's jump into the whole thing. So at least we can see there are no numbers here other than sample size, but at least we can see that this is relatively quantitative, generally demonstrated better outcomes than their office-based colleagues across 62 studies. Look, if I had to right now put on paper what is the finding here on our key question, the finding is that I think the findings would be a combination of things, but it would be um, a, particularly in certain roles like office work, and particularly in roles that don't involve significant collaboration. The effects of remote work on productivity are positive, but very, very moderate. I think that speaks to a lot of things. It speaks to the fact that our roles in business and office work are already highly globalized and remote. For instance, I, when I'm in office, I take more calls than I do meetings in person, far more. I mean, I'm in an office now and I'm taking very few in-person meetings. I have maybe a couple a week. I have a ton of calls. So it's interesting. I feel like we're starting to come to some conclusions. We won't get to our full conclusion in this video, and I'm going to try to wrap it up pretty quickly. But teams using collaboration tools report up to 25% higher productivity. Let's hope that is not. Whoops. Let's get back to our library. Let's hope that is. So that should probably not be a high priority if that's 38% experience productivity. Okay, that's the metric we're looking for. 38% of organization experience productivity improvements compared to this. So that's still not really the metric we're looking for. Let me do a quicker scroll and see if we've got anything. Not mentioned, not mentioned, not mentioned. A majority of research reported positive impacts. Okay, now, here we go. Transition, based on this paper, transition from work from home to work from anywhere result in a 4.4% increase in output. Now, that's not the metric we care about. Having said that, could that also, as part of its kind of regression model table, have the specific empirical result we're looking for? Yes, it could. So I'm going to mark that as high priority. Let's hope that updates. Hold on one sec. Let me make sure there's no kind of, based on the paper. Okay, I might not have saved it. Hi. Good. So I've now gone ahead and got my paper via the, couldn't get it through LibKey in this case, and so instead went to the publisher site. I was able to get it from there using my subscription and put it in here. Now I want to reiterate something important, which is you'll notice there has not been any chatting or AI features run on top of full text articles. I just want to highlight that very importantly. Everything we've done in terms of using full text articles has been manual review, and in the case of our typical reviews, if we had time, manual annotations like highlighting a PDF. I think that's something to sort of keep in mind. Here's work from anywhere. I had already mentioned we're going to jump into methodology. That's what we care about here. We want to know, really what I'm looking for at the moment is a regression table, and here it is. See if we can update this. Okay, now look, I think it's most helpful to use Moara for annotations. However, in the case of the regression table, I'm just going to open this up. Descriptive statistics and correlation matrix. So I'm working on understanding this. Work from anywhere. Causal estimates. Okay, so here's productivity is our target variable. Work from anywhere is our dependent variable. In this table, it appears to be a comparison between work from anywhere and work from home. We still do not have a comparison between in person and work from anywhere. I'm coming to the conclusion pretty quickly that this data does not exist in this sample, in this study, that we do not have a comparison between in person and work from home. Instead, it's purely work from home and work from anywhere. Okay, so if I had time, I would explore that further, but I can pretty much conclude, in my view, that that does not have the data we're looking for. Here, I'm going to put this as actually low, and I'm going to say comparison is between work from anywhere and work from home doesn't include in person. So that doesn't have what we're looking for, and that's fine. Both of those can now be low priority. There's one last check I want to do. Don't underestimate the use of Claude for very specific questions like this. And I'm going to say this. I'm having trouble finding empirical. Actually, you know what? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm having trouble finding specific quantitative estimates based on observational data versus survey-based data on the effects of work from home on productivity. Do you know of any metrics or studies? Now, this is really where you've got to check the Claude sources because on quantitative estimates, it really struggles. But in this case, let's see what it kind of comes up with. In the meantime, of course, yes, we don't have the estimates we're looking for. But of course, what we need to do is continue rifling through papers. I'll reiterate right now, I will probably be, so this work-life balance, introduction, I'm going to skim this, even though remote more common, there's still much to learn. Strikes me as a fairly informal study. Analyzes 25 publications. We run into the same type of issue. Also, through a very volatile period there. At first glance, I'm not loving this study, but I don't want to kind of judge a book by its cover. 6 objectives. I would love a table, or I would love a model. Articles. The number of publications that are released each year is shown. Documents by year. This is not the data we're interested in. Directly address the relationship with ESG factors. That is not the focus of my study. Overall, while the primary focus of research topic is on work-life balance and employee, remote work can intersect with ESG considerations. Results in discussion. Okay, that is a pretty uninteresting discussion section in my view. The results, the number of publications. I mean, discussion section should not be focused on one particular finding. In my view, the discussion section, certainly a results and discussion section, should be focused a lot more on summarizing all results and the scope of the study. So this indicates directly governance considerations. Okay, look, again, you hate to judge these things, but here's an example of this very poor formatting. You could tell this, even if it's in a journal, might not have either been peer reviewed or maybe there's a translation issue. On the whole, this is not looking like a very good article to me. The discussion section isn't very interesting. The results are not very comprehensive. The data points covered aren't interesting. It's just kind of a, in short, scoping review of the literature on this topic. And so what I'm going to do is immediately deprioritize the study and move on. Now, this is the last one I'll go through. Let me kind of scroll through the rest myself. I'll pause where I need to, and then we can get into writing. Okay, actually, I want to come back to the Claude response. It's very revealing. Part of this is knowing what questions to ask, right? Now we know what questions to ask here. Here are the examples we get. Call center employees randomly assigned. We did come across that paper and title and abstract screening. Yet another indication that we have pretty good coverage. All these ones I've seen so far, or I should say, the 2 that I quickly reviewed here, we saw in title and abstract screening. We've got good coverage on this topic. Call center employees randomly assigned to work from home, 13% performance increase over 9 months, 9% coming from more minutes per shift. That's interesting. That was pre-pandemic. Before COVID, remote workers answered 12. So this is pre-COVID and after COVID remote workers, less interesting. Using personnel, 10,000 IT hours worked increased. Hours worked increased, but average output declined slightly, so productivity fell 8 to 19%. Interesting. Okay. In a randomized controlled trial in India's data entry sector, workers randomly assigned to work from home were 18% less productive than those in the office, with 2/3 of the effect. Okay. And then 0% difference here. And then those are survey results, implied 5% aggregate boost. Now, here's what's interesting. The key pattern worth noting, self-reported productivity is systematically higher than objectively measured productivity. Now, just because Claude says it doesn't mean it's true. However, we had already talked about this a lot, is that survey results are always going to exaggerate certain effects. One study explicitly documented this, comparing work from home with working from the office shows that self-reported productivity is lower at home compared to working at the office, contrasted earlier findings based on self-reported productivity. Few reasons to consider, no doubt, conflating productivity, maybe not understanding what ultimately produces productivity, maybe not understanding how you're working with others, whatever. A simplified consensus on the quantitative estimates. So you've got low numbers, numbers that are really specific to one case. These are all cases. It's really hard to find aggregate economic studies. This one's self-reported. We're finding out that this is an unbelievably understudied topic, or if not understudied, at least there's a real shortage of real empirical quantitative results. So here's the deal. Anyone that says that they just know for sure, or even are very confident about this decision that executive teams have to make, work from home versus in person, what affects productivity. I mean, all sorts of articles out there, right, that report on this. We saw the CNBC one. Look at how little we know. I mean, that's what's kind of incredible about this. And that right there is the starting point of our client report. That is the starting point of how you should go about your research. If I'm doing this research and I'm a very ambitious scholar, the first thing I'm doing is saying, how do I be the one to come up with an observational, an empirical study that studies the effects of work from home, maybe a 1% one day increase in work from home on productivity. How do I do that with a regression model with observational data? It's going to be really hard. You might decide it's impossible, but maybe you can at least go broader than some of these other studies. Can you do it at a sector level? Can you use, once again, industrial production metrics for an industry? It is that is your contribution. If you are, again, a crazy ambitious researcher, that's where you come to. We have yet to find a single one of those studies. Claude did not find it. Undermine, if we go through the results, as far as I could tell, probably didn't find it. Doesn't exist in Google Scholar. That study does not exist. What an enormous contribution you could make. You could never have discovered that without diving into the literature yourself, knowing what to ask, etc. All right, so now we get into the sort of final. Obviously, there are many other things we can be doing, like going through maybe citation map analysis. And of course, we should be doing significant full text reviews, taking notes, reviewing them with our supervisors or colleagues or whatever. But if we're going to say the next step of this is writing, next thing we're going to do is, so we've got our effectively notes and annotations that we've made throughout our full text reviews. This is more or less what it will look like. You'll have, some data points that are included in each. And then the reason I think it's important to have those those annotations included and have them documented in this fashion is everyone has a different philosophy when it comes to research writing. I am of the philosophy that, how do I describe it? I think a lot of people create outlines first. A lot of people really prefer to have no AI involvement or automation in their writing. Some people prefer a lot. My view is absolutely that you should drive the outline, the formatting. And my view is you should, and I've said this before, generally drive in short, the kind of purpose in first sentence or two of each section. Now, when you get to a task like taking the data points in your associated with certain citations and stapling them to one of a key finding that you list. I do feel like that's something where you can involve something like Claude, or you can involve a AI writing tool. You can use the Moara AI writing tool. You can use the agent, whatever. So that's my general principle. You drive the agenda. You drive the key points. It's very important that you, of course, revise and iterate on the writing. The mechanical putting citations to statements and pulling out the exact data points, whether it's 12% in that study or 10% in the other study. Leverage the annotations to do that for you, in short. So I'm going to go back and forth with Claude. I've done this in prior sessions as well. We're going to talk literature review, effects of remote work on productivity. I would put some formatting work into this if it were client deliverable, obviously. But at a high level, I'll tell you how we structure our literature review is I'll do a summary. I will try to answer the main empirical question in the very first sentence and then add all the sorts of caveats as needed. This whole summary I might want to create myself. And then this is my approach. Of course, if you have for client work, if you have a dissertation or something, you probably want to go intro, methodology, whatever. But I usually do summary, then a series of empirical findings that I write out bolded as often as full sentences, and then you have your conclusion. So I'm going to start with the summary, and the first thing I want to answer is this, something along the lines of, remote work likely has a small positive effect on productivity, especially in industries where, or especially in roles which are already um, which already involve interacting with, how do you describe it? Let's say out of office team members, in roles which involve more. I might say something like this and then clean it up with the my with something like Claude, which involve more office work. Let me just write these out. Involve interacting with out of office team members, i.e., um, collaboration is more difficult remotely. Um, if your role is already set up uh, with strong communication technology, you'll be in a better position. This is pretty raw, but I have to tell you, this is how I would tackle this. I would write out my kind of key synthesis here, and then, like I said, I'm putting it into Claude and cleaning it up. If your role is already set up with strong community, you'll be in a position. So, what am I saying here? This is where I'm almost writing out key findings and trying to assign certain levels of confidence to each. So, remote work likely, already sort of caveating, small positive effect on productivity, especially involving out of office team members. I'll stop there. And then what I want to do is go back into my notes and say, are there any other specific areas where this really seems to be the case, where it is it's preference home working, minutes per shift, calls per minute among switch their work location when given the choice after self-selection. Right now I'm going through my annotations just to get a reminder. Quit rates reduced by 1/3 under hybrid. No effects on lives. Managers achieve perspectives, endorse positive change. Let's give them more creative. The use of online platforms as work from home productivity post-pandemic. Okay, there's one other caveat that I just captured, and that is if your role is already set up with strong communication, and if your role involves more routine tasks rather than creative problem solving. I don't know if I'll keep that in, but I'm going to write it for now. Those are, it seems to me, the three most well supported, let's call it kind of factors in driving productivity increases or decrease effects. So I'm going to start there. And then I am going to make a comment on saying the so altogether is not best practice to write this, but I'll write something like altogether, however, and let the sort of LLMs determine, let Claude determine how best to word this, knowing what the spirit of what I'm trying to say is. Altogether, however, the topic is, in short, still up for debate. I want to reiterate, this is not good writing, but let me just show you how. The topic is still up for debate. If I was writing a publication, I'd sit here and make my stuff wicked eloquent. But right now, I'm going to work on this. The topic is still up for debate because most studies, or because all studies that cover, because prior studies either, I'll say it this way. Most studies use survey responses, which tend to overstate uh, productivity boosts from work from home. The studies that do look at effects macroeconomically, of which there's only a handful, studies that do look at effects macroeconomically, of which there's only a handful, are survey-based, are entirely survey-based, and all studies based on real world, let's say, experiments or data or observational data are limited to one team, company, or industry. And I'm not even sure if industry is the right case. So that's a little messy and complicated, but we can assume Claude will sort of clean it up. We were unable to find a single study that looked at the effects macroeconomically with empirical data. Our conclusion, especially if it's a first report, I'll have no problem saying our preliminary conclusion. Of course, you wouldn't say that in a publication, but our preliminary conclusion is that most of the roles typically analyzed for work from home effects um, work from home effects um, are already set up with strong communication technologies and practices, and therefore the effects of actually working remotely are very small. However, one last thing I'd say is, therefore, note that the positive note, however, I don't like to use two howevers, but I'll clean that up. Note, however, that the positive effects of remote work, and I'm going to also ask Claude to standardize. If I say remote work in some places, work from home in others, I want to bring those together. I want to make this very buttoned up. It doesn't look it now, but it will. Note, however, that the positive effects of remote work on employee satisfaction are clearer and better studied. Are clearer and better studied. Therefore, this is not formal also, but I'm going to say on a net basis, we expect we initially expect some remote work to be a positive. Therefore, we expect, and again, let's make this formal a second. And then finally, some evidence indicates some evidence indicates that a hybrid approach, partly as a result, we can connect the two. Some evidence indicates that a hybrid approach maximizes productivity versus all in person versus all remote. So let's take that. I think those are the key points I want to cover. I might eventually decide that some of the secondary points I mentioned should actually be bolded empirical findings, but that's where I feel we'll get into some of those citation mechanics. So what am I doing here? I'm going to grab this summary and I'm going to put it in Claude. Once again, I'm just running through what my own process would be. I'm going to put this in here and I'm going to say something along the lines of, here is a first draft of the summary section of my literature review. I threw it together quickly. Help me to formalize it for a client report. Write concisely. And let me paste it in and let's see what this looks like. I won't go through every section. Maybe I'll cover this one. I'll cover what the heading might look like for the next section, and then we'll wrap things up. So I'm going to read through this. If I don't like it, I'm going to obviously iterate on it. And then I still might tinker a bit when I plug it into Microsoft Word. The academic literature, and by the way, why don't I have in-text citations here? It's because this is meant to be a very high-level summary. At this moment, I don't feel the need to staple 3 in-text citations to this first sentence. It just distracts, and I don't view it as a lack of attribution because I will include all of those citations in later parts of the report. The academic literature points to a small positive effect of remote work on productivity, with effect sizes and sign varying by role characteristics. Great. The gains appear largest where collaboration requirements are modest or well supported by existing communication structure and tasks are relatively routine rather than creative. Hybrid arrangements typically to show the most consistent positive or neutral effects. Fully remote arrangements show more mixed results. Hybrid arrangements, typically 2 or 3 days per week, show the most consistent. That's an example of something I would probably iterate on this because we don't actually, there was really, when push came to shove, only 1 or 2 studies on that topic. So I don't know if I want to emphasize that right up front. In fact, that might not belong in my introduction paragraph. So I might say something like comments. We did not, in fact, one comment is remove, I believe these are M dashes. This is my thing. I like to have hyphens. So remove M dashes, replace with hyphens, and then I'm going to say something like hybrid. So we did not, in fact, find this to be tremendously well supported, might not belong in the opening paragraph, or if it is, we should caveat it. Okay? All right, let's read through this, and again, then we'll close out. 3 limitations temper this conclusion. Not really the language I would use. That's something I'm going to tweak when I get into Word. First, the bulk of the literature relies on survey data, which systematically overstates productivity gains. Good. Workers, yep. Second, the small number of studies estimating macro rely exclusively on survey inputs. I might want to italicize exclusively since it's the same kind of point as made before. We identified no study that estimates aggregate productivity effects using, yep. Third, studies using administrative or experimental data are confined to a single team. Good. Our preliminary interpretation is that the roles most commonly studied are already preliminary, I'd say, kind of hypothesis, conclusion, et cetera, is that the roles most commonly studied are already well supported by remote communication tools and practices. It compresses the measured treatment effect of remote work towards zero. The evidence on employee satisfaction, retention, and turnover is substantially clearer and more favorable. On net, we expect some degree of remote work to be productivity positive once these indirect channels are included and the available evidence suggests a hybrid model. So look, it's very good. I'm actually going to skip this for now. Let me just do those and see what comes back. Then let's copy and paste. I would tweak if I was going through this full thing, but let's just see. Academic literature points good. I'm curious to see where hybrid enters the kind of equation now. Whoops. Probably a better way to do this, but let's just go back. Yeah. Evidence on employee satisfaction. On net, we expect some evidence suggests a hybrid model outperforms both. Good. That's where it belongs, in my opinion. Okay. So this is really good. I'm going to replace everything I've got with that. Okay. And again, I would tweak here and there if we had the time now. Once again, this isn't tremendously relevant because I think for a lot of the people watching, you'll have a preset, template. And indeed, if this were a literature review section, you might have sections, or you might just be writing something like this in longer form with in-text citations. You could very easily say literature review and explain a lot more, add in your kind of citations, and do it that way. In fact, not that I would advise this exactly, but I might, you could hypothetically say something like this. Whoops. Okay, we've got a little bit of a glitch here. You could hypothetically do this. Turn this into a formal literature review section of a paper, and you could say layer in key citations and quantitative results to support these. Now, again, I don't fully kind of advise you to do that, and if you do, you should certainly be reviewing it in depth. But what I mean to say is this is everything I'm preparing here. There's a direct analogy to the literature review section. Layer in key citations from below and quantitative results to support this, okay? And this obviously can be turned into a literature review section. Now, the one thing this can't do for you, obviously, is do what we did: identify a contribution, figure out what our own interpretations of the literature is. We'll recall that Claude had its own interpretations, and we, at least I think we came away feeling like they were kind of not correct. But nonetheless, this is what your literature review section could initially look like. This is what mine looks like. And if I had to pick what my next section would be, spoiler alert, the first thing I would probably describe is I would probably go, this can really be treated like a summary. I'd probably go right in order of first talking about that very specific empirical question: direct effects of remote work on productivity, direct effects and driving factors. Here is where I would get a chance to go into more depth. I would list out the specific articles and what geographies they were involved with, the extent to which, for instance, the point about routine work tasks versus not routine tasks, how reliable we feel that is. I would have maybe the second section would be something about the hybrid question. We might even call it the hybrid question. And we might say something like there's a lot of good surveys and theory about this, but anecdotally we don't know. We might have another part that says incorporating the employee satisfaction data or results, maybe one more, and then conclusion. And each one of these would be about the length of this section. It might be a 3-page report. So I don't mean to kind of just jump off a cliff here. Obviously, we did pretty much everything end to end, albeit if this were a real project, I'd have a lot more papers. I would do a lot more discovery up front, and I would certainly write a much longer report. Take that, multiply by 10, that's your dissertation. You know, it's you can see that it is not enormously, there's a very clear path to becoming a total expert on your topic. Okay, so that covers everything I wanted to. Now, if we're, as you know, if we were doing a formal client report, we would spend a lot more time looking through secondary research and articles and summaries. We would be adding a ton more papers to our library, doing a lot more screening and reviews, and certainly writing a big, full report. Take that, multiply by 10, and that is what you should really be doing for your dissertation or for your publication. This core process scales, in my view. You'll notice pretty much everything we did it very quickly, very effectively. So I hope this is helpful. Look, literature reviews are messy. The only way to get better at them is to just, kind of get into it, get into planning, get into working with papers. But I hope this gives you a really helpful starting point. The last plug is on the screen, and that is please visit Moara, Mother of All Research Assistants. That's the product I was walking throughout. We work extremely hard on that product, and hope everyone finds it really useful. So let me know any follow-up questions. I'm happy to get on a call with anyone that wants to chat. And thanks for the time. If you made it through this whole video, that is pretty incredible. Please comment and let me know. That'd be really cool. So really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.